Good afternoon. My name is Detective Ransom, and I was involved on the investigation of the tragic murder in 1986 of Rhonda Morrison in Monroeville, Alabama.
Become involved in this case?
I first became involved in this case when we found Rhonda Morrison, 18 years old, by the way. She was murdered at Jackson Monroeville in the cleaners. The cleaners. She was lying face down, blood on her face, her clothes, her shirt was partially unbuttoned, and we wanted answers quickly because we found 6 bullets in her.
To secure and process the crime scene.
Well, when we arrived on the scene, we locked down the dry cleaning business to prevent any commotion or anything that could have possibly been going on or occurred later on that day. So then we documented the body, the blood stains, the dust. And when I saw the dust on her body and the sense of the struggle, it made me think somebody might have dragged her.
And how were the statements gathered?
Well, yes, we had potential witnesses. We had people in the community, but one of the key statements that we received came from Ralph Meyer. And I actually have note of what Ralph Meyer said here. He was one of our lead witnesses. He said that he heard the gunshots. He ran in and saw Walter had the money in his hand like he had just robbed the dry cleaning establishment. And that just raised questions towards Walter McMillan. And he had no criminal history at the time. He was 45, a clear good history. He was a good man. But he had an affair with a white woman named Karen Kelly. And during these times, you shouldn't have even been caught looking at a white woman. So if I'm being honest, that's why we pinpointed him, because it made sense and we knew the court would have been on our side, which they were. So my companion, Sheriff Tom Tate, had arrested McMillan and arranged for him to be placed on death row before his trial even started, because they felt it was him. Looking back on the case, one of the biggest mistakes was ignoring all the testimony and all the facts that Walter was not the man who committed this crime and that he was innocent. But we didn't care. I'm going to be brutally honest. We didn't care. We just wanted him to be the target because he wasn't liked in the town. It haunts me because an innocent man lost years of his life. And this case reminds me every day that being a detective is not just about finding answers. It's about finding the right answers. And if we don't learn from the mistakes that we create, we will repeat the same mistakes and the justice system won't survive.
Hi, my name is Dante, and I'm the forensic architect on the Walter McMillan v. State case. To reconstruct the crime scene, I created a shoebox diagram of Jackson Cleaners. It makes it possible for us to visualize any sight lines, trajectories, or possible positions of the assailant relative to the victim's wounds. Now, we have to keep in mind that this model is a simplification. Because police moved the body and contaminated surfaces before forensic experts arrived, distances and placements are partially estimated. While accurate for analysis, it can't fully represent the scene with total precision. The reconstruction only partially supports evidence and witness testimony. The wounds, which are shots from behind, are consistent with the shooter positioned behind Miss Morrison, which matches some accounts. But contradictions start to emerge as police position her body in the back of the store, whereas witness Ralph Myers has her body positioned face up behind the counter. These different accounts of position complicate the reconstruction, which the model shows to highlight any inconsistencies in the initial investigation. This reconstruction supports multiple variations of the same scenario. The shots may have come from different angles, and the assailant can have approached from anywhere within the shop. The pathological report also states that Morrison was alive for 10 to 20 minutes after being shot, which further complicates our timeline. Now, because our crime scene was compromised and eyewitness testimony was coerced, I had to rely on typical dry cleaning layouts, photographs, and the data from the autopsy to estimate most distances and object placements. These assumptions need to be carefully noted to avoid overstating certainty and maintaining an unbiased perspective. In this case, I used crime scene reconstruction to map any possible bullet paths or shooter positions. For example, one of the shots was fired from within 6 inches of the victim, which is confirmed by gunpowder residue on her clothing. Placing these angles and possible paths or trajectories in the diorama help give us a better idea of where the assailant may have been relative to Morrison and where she may have been where she fought or struggled, suggested by the bruises and scratching on her neck. Now, the physical layout only partially supports witness testimony. Some descriptions fit the physical space, especially those describing her being shot from behind, but other accounts about where the body was positioned and where it was found are very conflicting. And this model helps highlight and reveal the inconsistencies about where Morrison's body was positioned. My biggest challenge with reconstruction was the fact that the investigation itself compromised the crime scene. With the body moved and the evidence contaminated, my job was to reconstruct mostly based on just fragments and contradictions of accounts of the report. Now, the shoebox model does simplify this, but it still needs to be stressed that the scale is symbolic and not exact. The reconstruction shows Morrison being alive until around 11:30 a.m., likely lingering for 10 to 20 minutes after being shot. It clarifies why internal bleeding was the factor that limited external blood being visible at the scene. Putting these medical findings into a physical space help us better understand the timelines of the crime scene and any inconsistencies that may come up in that of the prosecution. In short, forensic reconstruction helps turn pieces of evidence into a clearer narrative, revealing both how the crime unfolded and how any investigative failures may have obscured the truth. Thank you. The official cause and manner of death was homicide via gunshot wounds. 3 gunshot wounds to the back, upper arm, and chest led to severe internal hemorrhaging and her eventual death. Externally, her bleeding was minimal due to the small .25 caliber bullets used by the assailant. Now, the exact timing is always an estimate, but based on the internal hemorrhaging and eyewitness accounts, we can say that incapacitation occurred within minutes and death following roughly 10 to 30 minutes afterwards. Witness Miles Jackson reported seeing Miss Morrison alive at 10:30 a.m., which is crucial for our timeline. In the 1980s, estimates relied on body temperature, rigor mortis, and witness statements, and with that, we concluded that Morrison died at roughly 11:30 a.m., with a likely precision of plus or minus 1 or 2 hours. The victim sustained 3 gunshot wounds, one of which exhibited trace amounts of gunpowder, indicating that it was fired from less than a foot away from the victim. The bullet pattern suggests it was an assault from behind, likely using a small .25 caliber firearm. Multiple scratches and bruises were found on the victim's neck, suggesting a struggle, and her clothing was disturbed, but no semen or bodily fluids were found on her clothing or her body to indicate a sexual assault. There was no prior trauma, illness, or intoxication observed, and appellate records confirm negative findings in all these areas. The autopsy confirms homicide by gunshot, however, it does not link any suspect to the act. The prosecution claimed that Walter McMillan was the shooter during a robbery, but no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, or ballistics connects him to the scene or the weapon. The autopsy confirms rapid incapacitation based on the 3 gunshot wounds, and internal hemorrhage caused death within minutes. While the forensic evidence does confirm homicide, it still doesn't identify or link an assailant. Now, there are some inconsistencies and discrepancies within this case. Some of these include the fact that Ms. Jackson's witness testimony accounts for the victim alive at 10:30, which disrupts the prosecution's narrative. Along with this, some of the discrepancies include police investigating without waiting for the lab experts to arrive. Once they had arrived, the police had already moved Morrison's body to a nearby funeral home. Along with this, the initial police investigation was described as prone to error, such as covering surfaces with fingerprint powder, which contaminated the crime scene. Objectivity comes from reporting strictly observable, measurable facts, i.e. bullet paths, tissue damage, internal bleeding, and cause of death. I did not speculate about motive or suspect identity. In summary, Rhonda Morrison died to internal hemorrhaging based on the 3 gunshot wounds. Incapacitation was rapid and death occurred within minutes. Forensic evidence confirms homicide but is still unable to identify the shooter. This case highlights the importance of objective, competent forensic investigation and the limits of relying solely on eyewitness testimonial evidence. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kalia Bill, and I'm the forensic psychologist that's working on the Walter McMillan case. What evidence was found at the crime scene, and what does this mean? So, we do know that she was shot, bludgeoned, and strangled. All those 3 together are signs of overkill. The suspect could have been angry, mad, anything, something could have happened prior to this, but clearly it was emotionally driven. Also, the disarranged clothing, her bra was pushed above her breast, her pants were unzipped, her blouse was unbuttoned. Sexual motive. Even though there was no semen found in or on the victim, that could have meant that the assault was interrupted. They didn't get to finish. Anything could have happened, and no semen was found, but for sure there was a sexual motive behind her passing. Also, we found defensive wounds, the sign of her fighting back, defending herself, fighting for her life. Circling back to the fact that the suspect used 3 methods shows a sign of panic, a lack of planning, and chaotic thinking. You know, somebody who knew what they were doing, somebody who knew what they were going to go in here and do, they would have did it and done. But it kind of seemed like they were all over the place, just trying to find a way to get rid, you know? Based on the evidence, we could guess that the perpetrator could be male, possibly young to middle age, could have poor impulse control, because clearly, I don't know, it gives impulsive, like, it was just off impulse. He could have anger towards women due to prior experience or beliefs. Could personally know the victim, hence the attack was brutal, so it could have been personal. The attack was very brutal. A lot of times, the most brutal attacks are done by people that they know personally. Did you evaluate the suspect, and if so, what were your findings about their mental state during the case? So the suspect, well, the wrongfully convicted Walter McMillan, he was confused and distressed during the time of the case. You just got convicted for something that you didn't do, you weren't even nowhere near, and now you're sitting on death row for it for years. So he, of course, like anybody else, he was isolated and depressed. Spending years on death row led to trauma and decline in his mental health. So despite his sadness and his suffering, he worked with Bryan Stevenson to help clear his name, showing Walter's resilience and his strong willpower. So I also said that he was hopeful and determined later in the case, In your professional opinion, was the suspect capable of forming intent at the time of the crime? I said no. I don't think personally that Walter could have did this or had a motive to do this. He did deal with the white woman, so maybe that gave a perspective out to other people that he was capable of doing this. But the 2 psychological profiles that I made for each suspect, Walter's does not match the ones of the original real suspect. How reliable are criminal profiles in explaining this behavior in this case? I think that they are very reliable. A lot of questions that people have is why? Why did they do this? You need to know why. So talking to them, understanding the way that they think, their past experiences, their trauma, their childhood, what they went through to get where they are now, all that stuff matters because 9 times out of 10, there's a motive in that whole little storyline. So they're reliable. Did you find any evidence of corrosion, false memory, or unreliable testimony among witnesses? Yes, I did. Actually, a witness named Ralph Myers, he was psychologically pressured by law enforcement to testify against Walter. Clearly, the testimony wasn't real. He was forced, they threatened to, charge him with his own offenses if he doesn't lie and tell on Walter. So yes, there were false testimonies in this case. How do you evaluate the psychological impact on Walter McMillan or others involved? I evaluate the psychological impact by looking at him then and looking at him during.
My name is Miss Humphrey, and I worked as the forensic scientist for the murder of Miss Morrison.
Physical or biological evidence did you analyze in this case?
So some of the physical evidence that we analyzed in this case, the first thing I want to point out, the victim's body was lying face down near a clothing rack with blood on her face, on her clothing, and her body. That is the first thing I want to point out. That is how we found the victim. Some more physical evidence that I want to point out, we found 6.5 bullet castings all around the establishment. There were 3 around the body. A half of a bullet casting was also near the body, and 1 spent casting was near the bathroom at the back of the building. All the way at the back from where the body was found, and about 50 feet away from the body, there was another bullet casting found, and also 1 outside of the bathroom door. Now, going to the bathroom, that showed major signs of disarray. There was a bullet hole in the ceiling. The victim's gold necklace was found in the bathroom, so the victim and the suspect had to have been fighting for quite a while in the bathroom. Now, we did find a brick with hair on it, the victim's that we found to be, and also an impression on the wall in the bathroom from the brick that told us that maybe the victim had tried to throw the brick at the suspect, or the suspect had tried to throw the brick at the victim. It is unknown as of now. There was also dust on the victim's body, showing that she was dragged from where she had originally died to where the body was actually found. So where we found her body was not where she originally died at.
Were you able to obtain DNA, fingerprints, or trace evidence linking the suspect to the scene?
Now, we did find a drop of blood on the floor near the register, but because this case was in 1986 and also in Alabama, it wasn't accounted for because their DNA testing was not a commonly used practice in Alabama at this time. So some crucial evidence that could have led us to the suspect of this murder, we were not able to use because DNA testing was not available for us. There were no exact fingerprints found, only unidentifiable smudges, which to me is very impossible because of the disarray that this crime scene was in, and the fact that they had probably traveled from front to back of this establishment and there were no fingerprints found from the suspect is very hard to believe to me. But we were not able to identify any fingerprints of the suspect. And also the register that we found smudges on had been left open and was later found to have $35 missing from it. So this whole thing, this whole murder was probably a planned armed robbery that Miss Morrison unfortunately had to be a part of and had her life taken because of. That concludes all my evidence that I found from this crime scene.
I am the prosecuting attorney on the McMillan versus States case, aka the Just Mercy case, and here are a few questions that people have asked, and I'm here to answer them. What motive, opportunity, and means connected defendant to the crime? At the time, we argued that Walter McMillan had a personal motive tied to jealousy because of his affair that he had with a white woman. The opportunity was established by witness statements, placing him near the crime scene, and the means were presented through claims that he had access to a weapon. How did the physical forensic findings directly support the theory of guilt? In all reality, that there was little to none. There was no DNA evidence, there was no forensic evidence able to be identified pointing it to Walter McMillan, but the prosecution heavily relied on testimonies rather than science, framing a lack of evidence as an indirect support for guilt. What evidence links the suspect specifically to the crime scene? There was no DNA, no fingerprints, nor a weapon tied to McMillan. The case strictly relied on witness testimonies and no forensic science evidence. How do witness testimonies align with the forensic science, with the forensic evidence presented? Testimonies were inconsistent with the forensic record. The timelines did not fully match up. The physical possibilities of McMillan being there, the timelines overlapped. But we pressed them forward because they support the narrative that we needed for the conviction. Looking back, what influenced your decision to pursue charges so aggressively? There was enormous community pressure that really pressured me to solve the crime correctly. I mean, it's the 80s, and it's political pressure to deliver justice for the victim's family. Race and social standing played a role. McMillan was a poor black man in a relationship with a white woman, which made him an easy target. How do you reflect on the ethical responsibility of a prosecutor in cases with weak or questionable evidence? The responsibility should have been to tell the truth, not just a conviction. We failed that duty. If I'm being truthful, a prosecutor must weigh the strength and fairness of evidence, and in this case, we let bias, pressure, and judgment and cloud our work. What lessons have you taken away about prosecuting fairly in racially charged environments? This case shows that our justice system is flawed, and unfortunately, I have participated in a part of it. It's my job as an attorney to do correct in the eyes of justice. True fairness requires resisting bias and pressure from others and holding ourselves accountable to evidence, not public statement. I'm the defense attorney for the Walter McMillan versus State case, better known as the Just Mercy case. I'm here to answer a few questions that people have often asked, and here we go. Based on the evidence, what alternative explanation could fit the crime scene? The crime scene offered no physical evidence linking this case to Walter McMillan. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, or any type of physical forensic evidence linking this case, suggesting that this crime could have been committed by someone else, someone more personally connected to this. The timeline presented by the prosecution did not align with Walter's whereabouts, which were mentioned by lots of witnesses. Question number 2, were there any errors, oversights, or inconsistencies in the police investigation? Yes, many. From jump, the police moved the victim's body without any forensic scientists being present. Key witnesses who placed Walter 11 miles away from the murder. That was ignored by the jury and the judge. The investigation rushed to fit the crime scene to a suspect rather than letting evidence guide them. To my knowledge, there was no evidence present. And I feel like the police also failed properly to document and follow up any potential leads. Did the prosecution fail to consider any reasonable doubt or alternative suspect? Absolutely. There were multiple inconsistencies that raised doubt, or was just disregarded. Other possible suspects and motives were never investigated. The focus had already narrowed down unfairly onto Walter due to his infidelities that he had with a white woman. The prosecution focused that as a character rather than evidence. It was more of opinion versus fact. How do you challenge the reliability of the forensic or eyewitness testimony? There was no forensic evidence pointing towards Walter. Mr. McMillan. To the crime, only unreliable witnesses that has had past errors in the legal system. Eyewitnesses contradict themselves with timelines and whereabouts, and memory can be influenced by pressure, fear, money. In this case, the witnesses were coached to see fit what the prosecution needed. How did I handle the pressure of defending someone such against an overwhelming opposition? It required persistence and courage. As myself, I'm African American, and I deemed fit that I needed to help a fellow African American. Walter, we focused on staying grounded in the facts, protecting Walter's dignity, even as the courtroom and community painted him as guilty even before hearing the evidence. What evidence or testimony was most crucial in proving my client's innocence? The testimony of alibi witnesses confirmed that Walter was at a family gathering 11 miles away at the time that the murder happened. That was very critical. Additionally, exposing the prosecutor's star witness as reliable.